an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. It is the ultimate day of May, 2024. It's on the Ledger Ontario Politics Podcast. Dave Trafford here, along with the co-hosts, John Wright from Maru Public Opinion, Keith Leslie. He's way ahead of us. He's an hour ahead of us already. He gets up an hour earlier than we do. Everything else. How are things down in Nova Scotia this morning?
They're just lovely, actually. Nice sunny day, going up to hopefully about 20. Just perfect kind of day to, spring day. We're a few degrees behind Toronto, it seems, at this time of year, and we'll catch up in about another week or two.
Yeah. Well, we had one of those weeks here where it was a little bit up, a little bit down, but a little wiggy. There's lots to talk about what's going on at Queen's Park today. But I do wanted to just ask you guys: have either of you ever served on a jury?
No. I was called for jury duty, but I didn't make the cut.
Yeah, I was called twice and served once, and it's really interesting when we hear the dynamic, all the commentary around the dynamic in the jury room vis-a-vis the Trump convictions, and all the time people were talking, except for the lawyers who might have been involved with juries or those people who sat on juries. It's amazing to me, John, how it becomes the room itself commands its own sort of voice, that you can get 12 people to agree on one thing, more often than not. But the dynamic of the relationship in that room grows. And everybody kept saying to me, the longer it goes in the jury room in terms of, deliberating on it is one thing. And that's how they were kind of getting a sense of what the outcome was going to be. For me, as a guy who sat on the jury, not nearly as long as this one, the length of the trial, I think, also affects it too, because that creates this interrelationship with all the people involved on the jury. So it's an interesting view of what happens in terms of, civic responsibility. I think we underestimate more often than not how seriously, it doesn't matter the case, how seriously jurors take their jobs when called upon.
I'd say three things to that. Number one, if you want to watch a great movie, 12 Angry Men, of course, comes to mind. Great stars and everything, but it actually shows the dynamic of how one person in a room can change everybody else based on the discussion of evidence. And so at the end of the day, the direction from the judge matters, but it's also what does the evidence say? So that's the first thing. Secondly, it's a little bit like Cromwell, Richard Harris's overblown character in the movie, where he takes, the nobles into the room and he tries to get them to sign the death warrant. And he walks around the table and basically goes, did he do it? Yes, sign it. And he makes sure that happens. So when you look at the trial, there's a lot of histrionics that go on. There's a lot of Stormy Daniels stuff that was there. But at the end of the day, the question really comes down to a jury. And that is, did he know what he was signing? And did he sign it? That's kind of, it may have been that simple in the room where they all looked at it and said, well, he knew what he was doing and he signed the checks and there's a signature on it. Thank you very much. Goodbye. So there is a clarity that's also there. And then the tip I would leave for anybody listening to this is I got called for jury duty once and I wasn't able to do it, but they don't really care, right? Like you're going to go in and do that. So what I did was I asked to be moved to a coroner's jury, which you can do, which you walked across the hallway and simply said, can I do that? Never to be heard from again. So I tell you, it stays on the docket for a period of time and then it washes off. But coroner's juries are rare. So that's just another hint in terms of what you might do with your time.
Yeah, I get that everybody views this as an inconvenience, and I did as well, Keith, until I sat on the jury and I thought this should be required of everybody. You should have to sit on a jury.
Absolutely. And it shouldn't be just those of us that vote that get called for jury duty. It should be everyone. Because those of us that at least take the time to vote are engaged at that level. If you're not voting at all, anyway, a civic responsibility is clearly there. I find it quite stunning, and I did yesterday as the verdict came out, that there was not one MAGA on the jury that just wouldn't bow. There would be that one angry man that would not bow to this jury, and that they would be at least hung or not able to reach unanimous decision on all these counts. Then when they said that the first 9 counts were not checks that Trump himself had signed, they were signed by others, or apparently ordered by him. So when those first, they kept it guilty. I thought, oh God, if they've got him on those first 9, it's going to be all. And of course, it was all 34. So to the point of the jury duty doing its thing, as I say, I was quite stunned that there wasn't one, closeted MAGA supporter on there that just wouldn't bow to no matter what the evidence said. And so it does say an awful lot about the way people take jury duty very, very seriously, except in the case of O.J. Simpson.
Well, even the dynamic in there was kind of interesting. Once you dig into the history and everything else that went on in that particular case prior to.
Holy cow! But the jurors themselves now admit, they sat in there for 2 hours and were not going to convict no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what goes on. So the outcome and the aftermath of all of this, of course, was launched immediately after Donald Trump came out of the courtroom.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people, and they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a sore respect, DA, and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution.
John, he, by virtue of this and that short clip from the longer speech, this is radicalizing people now. And that's what's going to happen. It's not just rallying the core. He's going to radicalize Americans to his side in terms of where this is going to go based on that kind of language.
I don't see it any different than when he was in office or before he got into office. And I think when you take a look at, when you talk to Dave Schultz, who looks at American politics, very carefully, I think we'd all agree that his base and the people who have followed him have gone down that rabbit hole. So he's just preaching to 50% of the population, more or less. So I don't think it means really anything. I think that his call earlier that this was going to end up with riots in the street has not materialized in the last 24 hours, and he's still standing outside a Trump Tower delivering, his combative language. But I don't think anything has really changed, David. I do wonder, however, whether or not between the sentencing day, which is I think July the 11th, and the actual day of the election, how much the Biden team puts stock in this. I mean, they've been very, very quiet over the last number of hours, and it may simply be if I were in the room with the President of the United States and he asked me, what do you think we should do? And I'd say, sir, I think I'd be concentrating on inflation and a series of other things and the stuff, the meat and potatoes, and let him rant on his side, because you're not going to win over anybody. The inflation numbers come out this morning in the United States. It'll affect interest rates and the stock market, and it'll affect the bread and butter of everybody who lives and breathes in America. And I think that's the course I would be on. I wouldn't even call him a criminal. I'd just sort of move by and just call him that man, and just move on. So I don't know whether it's going to radicalize anybody, because I can't see, the United States getting any more radical than they currently are when they are around this circumstance.
Yeah. Well, good point. That's probably the saddest commentary so far, and it's easy to dismiss. All right, so let's get to the work at hand here in terms of what's going on in the province of Ontario. And up until, midday yesterday, I thought I had a reasonable handle on everything that was going on. and then the premier just steps up to the microphone at an event that was supposed to be about, new vaccines and so on. And the Prime Minister was there, the Mayor of Toronto was there, and Doug Ford offered his comment on the shooting at a Jewish school here in Toronto this past week. And let's face it, there's nobody who's cheering for that except the guy who probably pulled the trigger. So that you can get passionate about it, I get it. But here's what the Premier had to say.
Enough is enough. You're bringing your problems from everywhere else in the world. You're bringing it to Ontario, and you're going after other Canadians, as the Prime Minister said. Unacceptable. I got an idea. Before you plan on moving to Canada, don't come to Canada if you're going to start terrorizing neighbourhoods like this. Simple as that. You want to come to Canada. You want to be a resident of Ontario. You get along with everyone. I don't care what background, what religion, what race you come from. You know, the diversity is our number one selling tool around the world. We have 110 nationalities here in Ontario, 200 languages being spoken. And guess what? 99% of the people get along. There's wars going all around the world, but we still get along. So all this other nonsense that we've been seeing over numbers and numbers of months, enough is enough. I'm just had it up to here. And guess what? People outside those communities, they've had it too. They aren't used to this happening here in Ontario. I'm done with this stuff.
Keith?
Well, he's making kind of a big assumption there that it wasn't a homegrown crazy that went and shot up the school in the middle of the night. Targeting, you know, the immigrant groups. I think what I see here is a populist premier trying to tap into what he thinks is the dinner table conversation about the protests, the encampments, and then the escalating to this violence at the schools. And he's saying, you know, most of your lifelong Ontarians, in other words, you know, people who aren't immigrants or sons of children of immigrants, which is millions of Canadians now, are, you know, they're seeing the types of protests that we haven't seen, that this latest wave of newer Canadians coming in are protesting in ways that we haven't seen before. And it's shocking to many people. So I think that's what he was getting at. I don't think he's instantly being accused of being a racist. I don't think Doug Ford is actually a racist. He may be a bit, you know, xenophobic about immigrants coming in, and the numbers have overwhelmed a lot of Canadians in the last year. But I think what he's trying to say is that the level of the protest, the anti-Semitism that's just come so out and open, is shocking to many Canadians, and they do want to see it stop. But again, unless he knows something that we don't, and apparently the police have no idea yet who did the shooting. So to say that, you know, suggest that it was immigrants that had taken it to that level, as opposed to, you know, just there's enough Canadian anti-Semites that would have done something stupid or crazy like this. We just don't know. So he went a step too far there, clearly. But as I say, I think to try and label him as a racist is, again, a step too far.
I think that's one of those occasions where the EA steps forward and says what the minister really meant to say. You know,
and that's what happened.
And there was an
later.
apology
There was a
issued
clarification.
right away.
Oh, no apology, just a clarification.
Well, clarification. Let's put that there. And it's all washed away because of the stuff we just talked about with Trump and everything else. I mean, you know, if you were going to put out any bad news in a government, it would have come yesterday. So it would have got buried. Let me say this, though. If the sentiment was simply this, look, we're Canadians, and what we're seeing now is fights over things that are happening in other parts of the world, and those issues are coming to our streets. We don't want that, and don't bring it here. That's one argument that does sound, you know, in public opinion, a pretty strong tone. On the other hand, it also, you can't get around some of these issues when, in fact, there's a significant portion of the population that sees what's going on now as wrong. And secondly, you know, there are a diverse group of people who come to this country and bring some of those issues to our country. And when he says, I've had it up to here, and I'm not going to take it anymore, I mean, he's shouting to what are you going to do about it? I mean, it's a little bit like, you know, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, University of Toronto, I mean, get the president out on the lawn and say, get off the grass. Yeah, really? You know, I'll just have 28,000 more people show up. So these things are complicated. I just think, I agree with you, Dave. I just think, you know, the cheese slid off the cracker for a moment. He was trying to say something that probably articulated to a lot of people, but it was inappropriate at the time.
The best part was the look, and you'll see it in the picture that accompanies most of the story. The look on Justin Trudeau and Olivia Chow's faces.
Yeah, raised. Yeah, it was
at
like,
the podium.
Where is this going?
It is priceless. It absolutely is, because these are two politicians who would absolutely not be saying this. But again, I think, you know, Doug was just trying to express some sincere feelings about the level of the protests, the level of the anti-Semitism, the violence, the violent rhetoric that's being espoused all the time. Protest the war all you want. I mean, people are outraged at the horrors going on in Gaza, absolutely, but it doesn't justify blatant anti-Semitism in Toronto or in Ontario. It just doesn't.
Well, and I think part of the clip before he got into that was he was talking about, this is a school where little kids go to school every day. And, if it had been any other time, there might have been some little kid in that room or out in the schoolyard. So he's kind of bringing it home. And against the backdrop of the shootings in Montreal. So there are other things that have gone on and kind of lit that fuse for him. I get it. But I heard a line, the other day, let go of the past. It's never done anything to you. That's just not true in this case. It's just not true in this case. You can't let it go. So, everybody's trying their best to stick handle this. But as soon as you say what you think needs to be said, in this case, Doug gets in trouble.
Well, the question was to Trudeau and to Doug Ford, what specifically can you do to make the situation safer and better here now? And quite frankly, they all floundered. I mean,
none of them answered.
This, that, the other. Best wishes, thoughts and prayers, almost. No one's got this. And to Doug Ford, up to this point, has been pretty afraid to even discuss this issue. So I think what we saw was a man floundering, knowing that this issue is just fraught with dangerous potholes, and that he stepped in one.
So just to even put this in perspective, a poll I released last night, done for Evan Solomon and G0, basically asked the question, so how has the Trudeau government come off in dealing with this issue? Have they tended to support the Palestinians or tended to support the Israelis, or are they basically being neutral and played at both sides, just calling for peace and negotiations? 61% of Canadians picked they'd be neutral. I have to tell you that it's not often that I would say that numbers surprise me, but I was surprised at the weight of that. And where it was coming from was basically right across the country. There wasn't much deviation, a little more in Quebec. But I think the frustration with all of this is simply that, there isn't much that politicians can do at the moment. Like there really isn't. It goes to another journalist I was talking to weeks ago who said, we got to go in and we got to move those people off as soon as possible. And the reality is that it takes a lot of time and a lot of difficulty in order to do that. I'd finish by this and as a segue to the next thing and basically say, I don't think this matters worth a darn to his political career or to any vote or anything else. It's, it's a one and done and there you go because of other stuff that will come up. The thing that, interestingly enough, is probably going to have more effect is the beer store issue and the corner store issue. And that's complicated. It's fraught with all kinds of other issues and stakeholders going forward. And I think that's what's going to actually be more so for people to talk about.
Well, to the point where that story blew up, and we left it last week just before they made the announcement. And I think, John or Keith, one of you said, I really want to know what this is going to cost. And my response was, I think generally people won't care what it costs just because we're kind of in that frame of mind. But as it came out with a slow drip courtesy of Rob Benzie at the Toronto Star, the $225 million price tag sounded relatively low to me in terms of the overall picture. But then Rob and his team start except, and I think the number came out that on annually for the next number of years, it was going to be another as much as $150 million. So over the course, we're talking about $1 billion deal to get out of a deal with the beer store so that we can put beer in there. And then Doug went on Jerry Agar's show and tried to do his math. And I don't know about you, Keith, but it always astounds me how they can just spit out the numbers without context, without any homework. They don't show their work, and people eat it up. Like there was nothing that backed up what Doug Ford was saying around this is going to be the economic benefit that we're all going to get from this, breaking the deal with the beer
first
store.
Of all, I want to point out that in raising that last week, you were quite prophetic because you said Who's going to listen if it costs $1 billion? People aren't going to care. You hit the $1 billion figure last week, which it took Benzie 3 days to get to. To be fair, it's actually, it's there's more immediate cost even than that. There's the $225 million going to the beer store that Doug Ford looked at it and said, that's not going to the Labatt and Molson. No, that's going to the workers. And then the finance minister, Peter Bethlenfalvy, said, well, it's probably going to go to help the beer store keep open some unprofitable beer stores as all these other retail centers can sell beer. And sell different packs of beer and all that sort of stuff. But the fact that they're spending, there's $350 million in LCBO rebates that they're going to have to give back now. The LCBO has to give back the beer store. So there's $600 million right there. And then the Liberals and the others come up, as you say, the $150 million, the forgone fees. Anyway, it looks $1 billion, which people, this is to break a 10-year agreement with the beer store in the 9th year. I was there when David Peterson promised beer and wine in the corner stores in 1985. Ontarians have waited 39 years for this. I think one more year wouldn't be too much to ask if they knew it was going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars for government to say, we're going to get it this fall instead of next year when the agreement actually expires. The only political reason for that would be, of course, and that's really fueled all this snap election. Snap being not this year, but next year in 2025 before the federal October 25 election. And it's basically because this is a promise made, promise kept. And, why else would you spend hundreds of millions of dollars to get the beer and wine into more corner stores, gas stations, allow them, the big box stores to sell 2-4s and 30 packs and give them all a 10% discount? Why would you be doing all of this in the middle of a mandate if you wanted to use it as a pivot to an election, unless you were going to call an election in next spring? I somehow still doubt that. I think Ford is playing with the media with this by refusing to deny it. He's been very clear. Oh no, there won't be one this year. There won't be one this fall or anything. But I can't say about the fixed date and next year or what. He's playing with the media.
Well, he's told Jerry, stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Was his line.
Because if we're talking about that, we're not talking about the green belt. We're not talking about the closed emergency departments. We're not talking about overcrowded hospitals, homeless encampments. We're not talking about all that stuff. If we're all in the media, we're all spec'd all this week on all of this being predicated on snap 6 months or 8 months from now election. I just see it as the Ford government playing the media for this on this one. He may indeed be considering an election. I hear he actually is considering it, sometime next year. But so what? What has that got to do with what we're doing right now, which is hundreds of millions of dollars going to the beer store? Why? So they can sell more beer to us at a bigger profit a year earlier than was originally planned. It just makes no sense to me.
I always find that with these announcements, especially with the Ford government, that the communications isn't thought through entirely. So if the three of us were in a room on a consulting contract, we would all look at each other and kind of go, what are the things that they're going to say about this and how do we need to frame it? Rather than, let's just go out and announce it and say a few sidebar things and our base will look after us. I think the first thing I would have said is that this is a trade-off for money that would be spent for other things. So we better put our ducks in a row here, because you're going to be challenged by people who say $1 billion for this versus $1 billion for emergency care. There you go. It's a ballot question. It's beer for these guys. It's healthcare for us. Where do you want to be? The contract itself, and being around this issue a little bit myself, you know that the sticking point in a lot of this was simply the recycling bill. Like, where does it go? How do you do this in infrastructure? And maybe that could have been the central point of this in terms of we're going to do X, Y, and Z, as opposed to the economic aspect of it. I know there's people who are now coming out and saying that this is, beer will probably cost 50% more if it's going to be in a corner store. You know what? God bless them all. I mean, I can go and if I want to pay 50% more to Jan and Bob up the street because I can't go to the beer store and I just need a 6-pack for the weekend, so what? The market will determine that. I think what's been handed the opposition parties, and the question is whether or not they plus their stakeholders can get involved in this. And we are running into the summer, so there may not be the time to do it, is just what I said. You got a choice here. Everything that this government seems to do is done without a whole lot of thought about the impact of where it could be headed. And if the opposition simply says, you got beds or beer, take your pick, I think that's their ballot question to move into for before the House rises, and to take it across the summer and beyond.
Well, and to grow on that, not only has it been poorly communicated, the consultation part of it is an issue, because I heard from, I've read pieces in the papers this week talking about the retailers who, like Costco and the big box stores. This is great. We're going to be able to sell 2-4s, but they have to also take care of the recycling.
But that's the issue.
So all of a sudden they need to have infrastructure in their facilities that they don't already have.
I see a loophole.
To deal with that.
A loophole. It's any retailer with more than 4,000 square feet of space. And something tells me we're going to have a lot of 3,900 square foot Loblaws and Walmarts. Just something else may be hived off. The garden center may be hived off separately or whatever to keep the square footage down. But I see a huge loophole there because they really are counting, and it's a big part of this agreement, that the beer store do keep up the recycling. They will be the pivot point for it all the way through this. And it may end up being, the raison d'etre that the people that sell us our beer and wine will not be unionized, but the people who recycle the bottles will be.
Well, I also keep in mind there are different ways in which the $1 billion can be sliced. There's all kinds of sections in this. The question in my mind was, are you really putting your foot down on the gas to justify this based on it's going to put it in the corner stores and be more convenient? Is that your argument? Because if that's all it is for that $1 billion, sure enough, that you're going to get hoisted on your own petard. No question.
Well, but it speaks to priorities, right? Sure. I mean, the period. That's all it is. And if you talked about healthcare, John, putting $1 billion in that, let's go down the food chain to get closer to the ground. Housing. I mean, if we're not putting $1 billion into housing, we're already behind on that. I suggest, and I heard, Sherry DeNovo was on Twitter, on X this week, screaming about where $1 billion should go. And I said back to her, okay, then where the hell is Merritt Stiles? Where is Jagmeet Singh? And saying that $1 billion should be spent on eradicating poverty in this province. It costs us $30 billion a year right now. Let's take that down a notch, get people out of poverty. And at that point, that's a priority. That there's relative cost savings there that we can actually point to and say that matters in the lives of Ontarians. That matters to the bottom line just generally. And that's where it's needed. If you're even going to put it into affordable housing, that's great. We do have a crisis in affordable housing. But at this stage, the people who really need it, doesn't matter what you spend on affordable housing initiatives. They're not going to be able to buy into it. They just don't have the means.
Says you're wrong. Everyone on the media is wrong.
I know.
And, he's got better numbers here that show this is going to mean a huge increase in sales and benefits to the Ontario taxpayer because of this. Now 10,000 outlets are going to be selling beer and wine in all sizes of containers, and that's just going to be fantastic. Despite the fact, as John pointed out earlier, the communications, the rollout on this, why it took the Premier 4 or 5 days later to get on the radio and start trying to explain stuff. Radio's not a good place to be doing numbers, by the way. No. Just throwing that out there. But where was the background of when this deal was put out? Here, okay, we're not showing you the actual details of the deal, but here's the highlights that we can show you. And then, $225 million, which the Premier is going right to the workers. Well, no. I know we'll line them all up and we'll give you a cat. No, it's absolutely not going to. It's going to be to protect some of their jobs for a while, I suspect. But all of it, the numbers game, unfortunately, works for governments that want to use them to bat down the opposition or to just get people to go, oh, Christ. The government, the opposition says it's going to cost us $1 billion. The government says they're going to make hundreds of millions. Give me the beer. Oh, I got to pay more for the beer at the corner store. Well, I figured I'd have to pay more for it at the corner store. It wasn't going to be cheaper. But it will be cheaper at Loblaws and Costco and Walmart because they're all getting a 10% discount from the guy that negotiated this, the chairman of the LCBO, this developer, Carmine Nigro, didn't he have development contracts with Walmart, Costco, these big places, Loblaws? Shopping? It's just all so incestuous that government for the little guy is once again making sure the big guys are really taken care of and will be able to sell the beer cheaper than the convenience stores will. So
the polling that's being released on this in the province of Ontario and across the country has wide support for selling it in the corner store. So that's a given. Whether you drink alcohol or not, you're okay. There are some conditions that go around that, obviously, because you're going to be putting more cash in tills or whatever you want to have, or people just, I mean, right now in downtown Toronto and in a lot of other places, just walk into a liquor store and put stuff in a bag and walk out. So I don't know whether that's going to happen in other places, but it could. To the point is that when you're explaining, you're losing. Like listen to us. We're talking about the minutia of all of this sort of stuff and not the benefit of it. Or we don't have the clear talking point as to why we are doing this now, and a clarity of, here's a bottle and here's the different levels that are figured in it so that we know where the money's going to and on what basis. I wonder, given a government's penchant to walk things back, the big things and some other things, whether the heat over the next 6 months gets big on this and it's kind of like, well, we better put it off to a committee for 6 months or something. I don't know whether that's going to happen. But again, to your point, I wonder where the NDP is on this. I wonder where the stakeholders are at this. I mean, there was a health coalition that took over Queen's Park, 48 hours ago, and it's the sort of thing that they could have brought all a case of empties to the front legislature and put them there to get that point across. There's all kinds of things you can do because it's just been laid like a big egg right in front of everybody or something else for them to take advantage of.
Well, could you just make the point anecdotally, and to your point, John, about the empties? We were moving empties out into the garage one day. We just had a box and we had some of the empties in it, whether it was liquor bottles or beer bottles. And just so happened, this woman was driving by our house and she stopped and she got out and said, are you going to take those to the beer store? And I said, eventually, do you mind if I took them? And I looked at her, she said, I could really use it. And it might have been $6 worth of empties. I mean, really? That's who is hurting in Ontario right now. And we're going to spend $1 billion to get out of this fucking deal with the beer store and prop it up so that we can have more convenience, so that I can walk to the corner store and buy a beer when, I don't need that level of convenience if that woman is better off with that money spent on her. Right? Jesus.
And it's funny you say that because, Josh and his buddies all graduated from university this week. But they were over here on Friday night, and between them, and you can understand, a bunch of 6'2" hockey kids sitting in the backyard having beers and hamburgers. There were a lot of bottles that they went through, right? So much so, those great big round blue recycling bins, 2 of them were filled. Then the question became to me, much like you said, Dave, and that is, what am I going to do with this stuff? Like, I'm not going to put them in a bag and schlep over to the beer store and do this. What I'm going to do is put them in a proper order and put them out for the recycling the night before, because I know people need them. What an incredible testimony, though, that you're saying here. Those will be gone in no time, much like when you put things out, on the sidewalk, hoping that someone will take away a printer that, you don't use anymore.
Oh, in Cabbagetown, our neighborhood in Cabbagetown, every week, this lady, she had a bicycle and she couldn't ride the bike because it was just strapped with too many bags of beer and liquor bottles that she was pulling out of the recycling. And so we would put them out. We'd put them in bags obviously. Yeah. You say, we're not, we don't, most women don't want to go near the beer store in the first place. It's still a place that they just don't find comfortable as a retail outlet. But that we could just, I'd going to go back to the store for Dave says for $6, unless I'm buying more beer. Well, no, I'll just put them out there. Someone can actually use that money. There's an awful lot of people for whom $6 makes a big difference in a day. Yeah.
So let me ask you this then, with all of that, and I saw John Michael McGrath at TVO writing this week talking about, the perils of an early election for Doug Ford. He talked about the housing agenda. At some point, what does any of this catch up? Because I think the whole line about elections in the short term is just utter bullshit. I don't understand why they would signal, can be an early one, but it's not a year from now. I mean, that just is not a snap election to me. So you're right, Keith. I think they're playing the media on this in terms of distraction. But when we do get to it, at what point does any of this matter or catch up to them? Because, beds or beer. I mean, I can see that, John, all of a sudden being there. And we can say what we want about the government of the day. But the opposition has been really ineffective, although I got to give Bonnie Crombie some credit for the booze-boondoggle thing. I don't know why she just didn't call it the booze-doggle.
She heard that on the way to the newsroom. She said, oh, someone said that to us. Oh, I should have $1 billion booze-boondoggle. Yeah. Booze-boggle.
Yeah. Yeah. But at what point does any of this matter in terms of the opposition traction? Because I just there's no there. We're back to what you were saying last week.
Well, I again, tactically, when it comes to election timing, what I think the seed that's being planted here is more of we don't have to stick to a date. I don't think it's so much, whether they pull the plug. It's that they can have and manage pulling the plug when they want to. There are lots of situations that we've seen in past decades where we would have been around Queen's Park, where you hoist the budget and go to the people whenever the hell you want. And it's been a set, time frame that's been in to make it predictable for a bunch of reasons. But it really doesn't have to be that way. So I think by him saying stay tuned is priming the pump for something that may or may not come, but it really says I've got control over this and I can call the shots when I want to call them.
But Keith, it kind of goes back to stuff we've been talking about over the last few months. This has been all about electioneering and not about governing. This entire mandate. I mean, since he was elected 2 years ago this week, right? That's what has been the focus.
Highways, hospitals, we're doing the big stuff. But what are you doing day to day to govern? Why do we still have homeless encampments in virtually every town and city now? Why are there so many other issues that are just not being dealt with in your housing file, your signature file? You're falling further and further behind. Yes, you can blame the interest rates, you can blame the Federal, the Bank of Canada, but your issue, you brought the housing on and you're just falling away. The governing, the day-to-day seems to elude these people. It's all about the messaging, the going forward. As you say, let's talk about the election that may happen in 2025, because we don't want to campaign against Pierre Poilievre. Nonsense. Doug Ford could campaign just as easily against Pierre Poilievre at the federal Conservative Party as he could against Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, or any other leader and the Liberals, because I think there's a lot of differences there. But all of this is just electioneering, as you said. There's very little of the day-to-day being solved. Doug Ford promised to tackle hallway health care. Well, yeah, he's tackled it now. We're out in the parking bays because we can't get out of the ambulances to get into the hospital and in the emergency department. It's gotten worse. We know it's gotten worse. So for that key question, are you better off today than you were, say, 2 years ago when Doug Ford? Well, no. I think people are feeling, and there's another 2 small town emergency rooms are being closed this weekend. The hospitals are losing their beds. All these issues are going on, but it's the day-to-day. They don't seem to, locally these issues play. Even the Ontario plays and the Greenbelt issues play to some degree, but nothing seems to be one major issue that holds this government to account. And I think in the end, it may end up being, hopefully, the RCMP report into the Greenbelt.
If I walked into the Premier's office today and that question was put to me, how are we doing? I'd say, well, you came in at 40.6%. You won the last one around 40%. Last time I looked, between the latest polls that came in the last week and a half, it's 40%. I'll see you up at the cottage. Goodbye. I mean, if you want to be cynical politics about this, you still have to get 37% for a majority government. And he blows the doors off with a massive majority, which goes to the other point, is we have, these are mainly urban Toronto type issues where the Liberals, may hold St. Paul's yet again, but outside of the centers, there are other issues that matters. Okay, Muskoka's got, and some people have got emergency wards and they're closing it. We can criticize that as well. But the reality is that beer in the corner store is a local our issue, right? Like it's a downtown issue and it's not an outside issue. The question you said, you pointed to the right thing. What is the issue that binds us together? What is something that can be made of this? And again, I come back to, when we talk about billions of dollars spent on booze, and see, now you got me saying booze instead of beds. There is a campaign here. There's a button, there's a sticker, there's a placard, there's a movement on this, and it can be, standing outside of emergency rooms with cases in your hand, of empties and saying, take your pick. But the question is whether or not Bonnie Crombie and Merritt Stiles have got the people to do this and the stakeholders that they can rally around on it. I don't think they've got it. So, we're going to be out of here on June 16th? The House will rise and it'll be gone until September, and the Premier will be up at the cottage, and, we'll get on with life. So I don't know whether they can take advantage of it. All I know is it was just laid out this week, and we just told them how to do it.
All right, let's leave it there with a few other things that we had on the agenda, but maybe we'll put a pin in them. We'll come back and chat about it next week. And, of course, next week will be the deadline for the TTC strike, so I'm guessing that'll be on.
Wait till 3 days after it starts, and then we'll see whether or not there's some way.
We might have to have a special, edition, an emergency session of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. It's for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.